Hello everyone and welcome back to another one of our little Warhammer 40k FAQ videos. We do these on occasion when Games Workshop comes out with another major balance patch, mainly the chapter approved books and the big FAQs. And today, the big FAQ number 2 of 2018 has finally dropped. So we're going to take a look at it, go through a couple of the new rule changes. We'll also be looking at the errated rules in the normal Warhammer 40k rulebook. More, we're going to be going over the question and answer section because the actual rule changes in the wordings isn't super important. It's just a couple of clarifications, and we'll also be going over the few things that changed in the Imperial Guard Codex. For those of you who don't know, I'm an Imperial Guard player, mainly Catechins, but I will be basically going through all of this with the perspective of that. So, without further ado, let's get into things. So, finalized match play rules. The Battle Brothers match play rule was introduced as a beta version back in spring of 2018. It is now in its final form of this match play rule. Battle Brothers. All of the units in each detachment of your battle-forged army must have at least one faction keyword in common. In addition, this keyword cannot be Chaos, Imperium, Eldari, Ynnari, or Tyranids, unless the detachment in question is a fortification network. This has no effect on your army faction. This is good. So this was baited way back in FAQ 1. This was a good idea back then. It is still a good idea right now. It's basically just a way to try and remove soup lists from the table, which is a very positive thing. Now, there is still the very funny threshold, and the only reason, or not threshold, but loophole that you can use, and the only reason I know about this is because I was messing around just trying to figure out what I could do to break this rule a bit, in that the Imperial Guard can actually get Sisters of Battle souped in with them. So if you ever want to be a little bit cheeky, all you need to do, in order to get Celestine into a standard Imperial Guard detachment, is to simply make sure that you have a single Ministorum Priest. Because the Ministorum Priest in the Imperial Guard Codex has both Astra Militarum and Astra Ministorum. Because he has Adeptus Ministorum, he can also be daisy-chained in any Sisters of Battle unit, which just is hilarious to me. It's a loophole, it's not a particularly useful loophole, but it exists, but that's fine anyway. Battle Brothers existing basically is there to get rid of the annoying detachment that is things like bringing Guilliman, an Imperial Guard Company commander, a Celestine, and something else. So, positive change, excellent. It's nice to see that this is now an official, fully done rule. In addition, the following two match play rules, as confirmed in the spring update, continue to apply. Psychic Focus is just every single time that you smite, you have to increase the difficulty of that smite, and you can only try to use a Psychic Power once per turn. No change there. Targeting characters is again just characters can't screen characters. If you're trying to figure out who's the closest unit, you ignore characters for the purposes of that. Again, both were great changes. We were happy to see them in the first big FAQ update, so no major change there. But now we come to one of the big rules from the big FAQ 1, which was, in my opinion, really dumb for quite a few reasons, and I ended up having chats with several other people about even more reasons why it was dumb. But they have modified it a bit, so it's not quite as bad. I'm still not a huge fan of this rule, but we'll talk about more after we read it through everything. So, Tactical Reserves. Following feedback, we are changing the Tactical Reserves beta match rule to play proposed in the Spring 2018 update, which was itself an update to an existing match play rule in the Warhammer 40k rulebook. That's a little bit not quite correct. I mean, there were some things as to what could be put in reserved and what couldn't, but they really did change this rule pretty significantly. I wouldn't call it just an extension of the previous rules. The original wording in the Warhammer 40k rulebook restricted the number of units that could arrive during the game to half your army, but the intent was half your army's strength. The first beta version of this rule clarified this to be half the power level of your army. But as matched play games are typically used points values instead of power ratings, we have clarified this should instead be half the points value of your army. Positive change. This makes a heck of a lot more sense. Even when limited to half your army, the ability to arrive on the battlefield mid-game remains very powerful, enabling units to do so to arrive where they will be most effective, whilst granting them immunity from attacks until they are on the battlefield. Armies that use this as a heavy proportion of their reinforcement units continue to dominate many gaming tables, which is why we have felt it necessary to rein in the power of these abilities in the spring 2018. However, our original beta rule, which limited the units that arrived as reinforcements during the first battle round to be set up within their own deployment zone, received a lot of mixed feedback. I would say a lot of negative feedback, but mixed feedback will be charitable. Whilst it did help rein in the power of some armies that used a heavy proportion of reinforcement units, it also raised a lot of questions from players regarding which units, abilities, powers, and so on were affected. Some players felt it was unfair that all of their units were restricted, whilst all of their opponents' units were exempt. Perhaps the biggest criticism we received, though, was that the rule seemed to break many players' suspension of disbelief, as they could not understand the background reasons behind it. What was the rule representing on the battlefield? As a result, we're proposing a new version of this rule that is designed to rein in the power of reinforcement-heavy armies, whilst also maintaining a more narrative theme. To that end, units that arrive as reinforcements must now wait until the second battle round to do so. They are reserves that arrive to reinforce your army mid-battle, not to reinforce it before your opponent has had the chance to move any of their own models. We also felt, because it was so different, that we should re-release this as a beta match play rule, rather than enshrine it in the rules before the wider community has had a chance to provide adequate feedback. We have also removed the exemption that Gene Stealer cults had in the previous beta version of this rule. Rest assured, this has been taken into account for the Codex Gene Stealer cults, which is currently in development. Tactical reserves. Instead of being set up on the battlefield during deployment, many units have the ability to set up on teleportariums, in high orbit, in ambush, etc., in order to arrive on the battlefield mid-game as reinforcements. When setting up your army during deployment for a matched play game, at least half the total number of units in your army must be set up on the battlefield, and the combined points value of all the units set up on the battlefield during deployment, including those that are embarked within transports that are set up on the battlefield, must be at least half of your army's total points value, even if every unit in your army has the ability that would allow them to set up elsewhere. Furthermore, in matched play games, units that are not placed on the battlefield during deployment in order to arrive on the battlefield mid-game as reinforcements cannot arrive on the battlefield during the first battle round. Finally, any unit that has not arrived on the battlefield by the end of the third battle round in a matched play game counts as having been destroyed. So this is a much better version of this rule. I'm still not super happy about it because I don't really like limiting the way that you can drop people in to be aggressive, but this does resolve quite a few problems. Now, one of the major criticisms that I ran into that I didn't notice that they raised in this was the strength that this gave gunline armies, the original version of the Tactical Reserves rule, which allowed you to drop on the first turn, but only within your own zone. And so if you played a gunline army like the Tau, or say the Talarn, with their ambush outflank ability, you could set up a very large, powerful, heavy unit in reserve. And if you didn't get first turn, that unit, which would normally be a fire magnet, would be completely protected, and then on your first turn, you simply bring it in behind your own lines, and now it can blast the rest of the battlefield. Since a lot of these super heavy, super expensive, and super powerful units also have ranges of beyond 48 inches, it didn't matter where they set up. Just it put them in an invulnerable position, while the enemy, if you were using a deep-striking assaulting army, well, you were just kind of screwed. So this version is much more fair. I like this a lot better. I am still not 100% on trying to limit tactical reserves in this way. I do think there should be a better way to do this, but one, it does make a lot more narrative sense, and I suppose there were some people who were complaining this didn't make any sense narratively. And because this now places the restriction on both sides, just saying, you know what, first turn, deep strike, nobody has access to it, that makes things a little bit more balanced with gunline armies. I am still a little concerned, though, about armies that really do rely heavily on positioning that are not traditionally deep-striking armies. One thing that comes to mind, it is a traditionally deep-striking army, but it's not in the way that Games Workshop has made it, is units like the Elysians. Now, Elysians will probably be going away soon. They're no longer available in the Forge World store, and I am highly confident that most of the Forge World stuff is about to go away. But when you do have units that are supposed to take advantage of position, the fact that they're not allowed to position on the first turn, I'm not super happy about it. But that's a somewhat minor concern. This is a much better version of Tactical Reserves. I'm much more pleased to see this. I wish this had been the original version so that we could have all of those months to figure it out. But better late than never, and I am kind of pleased to see it. I will be interested to see where they go with this in the future. I am hoping for more exceptions or certain loopholes, or trimming back even more, because I do like the idea that a first turn deep strike should be something you can do. It should be something that you can pull out of a hat, even if your army is not explicitly designed to do in stratagems. I like having those options by just creatively making use of certain deep strike abilities. But if this actually goes in 100%, and I kind of think it probably will, this will not be terrible. This is not a bad rule. It's just not as good as I would hope and imagine it would be. But again, good job, Games Workshop. You took in the feedback, you tweaked it in a way that really has made the rule much more viable. Moving on. Related errata, this is just for everybody's specific stratagems that allow them to move prior to things. So the Chaos Space Marines, Adeptus Mechanicus, they all have things that allow them to do it. One of the main things I believe is that has changed is just you cannot end your move within 9 inches of an enemy model. So that does give Scout Move a little bit of its use back, but it's not a super big deal. So new beta match play rules part 2. Oh no, just the 2 main ones, I suppose. We're also introducing the following 2 new beta match play rules: prepared positions and tactical restraint. As with our previous beta match play rules, do let us know what you think. Prepared positions is a stratagem that is available to the player who has the second turn in the game. Often, taking the first turn gives a player a distinct advantage, enabling them to target and shoot their opponent's units before they can react. This stratagem gives the player who has the second turn a chance to better weather the storm. And we'll talk about this first because I want to talk about each of these 2 new rules separately. So, prepared positions, a stratagem that costs 2 CP and is only available to the player who has the second turn in the first battle round, has access to the following stratagem. Use this stratagem at the start of the first battle round before the first turn begins. Until the end of the first turn, all units from your army that are wholly within your deployment zone, other than Titanic units, receive the benefit of cover, even while they are not entirely on or in a terrain feature. A unit that is already receiving the benefit of cover gains no additional benefits from this stratagem. I think this is an interesting approach. I didn't view first turn as being so cripplingly critical that you would need to do this, especially because if you take a look at not having the advantage on a roll. So the way that you determine first turn is after you have finished deployment, whoever finished deploying all their units on the field first gets a +1 to the roll, and then you roll a 6-sided dice. Whoever gets the higher number wins. And then afterwards, you have the chance to seize the initiative, which you roll a dice. On the roll of a 6, you seize the initiative, and you get to have the first turn. If you actually do the math to add all that up, what you come out to is even if you deployed your last unit after your opponent finished, so your opponent has the +1 and you don't, you actually have a 50% chance of getting the first turn if you throw in also rolling against off them and then rolling for the seize the initiative. So first turn is really just a 50-50 coin flip at the end of the day. Yeah, it may take a little bit longer to get to that percentage, but that's where you're at. So this gives second player a little bit more of a reason for why you might go second. If you have an army that gains certain significant benefits from being in cover, and there are a couple of them, then I can see this being pretty decent to actually have the option of letting them move first. You take this stratagem to bulk up your army. That has them move closer to you. This really kind of works for assault armies, because this works in several ways. So first of all, you're gaining the benefit of cover. I'm not quite sure how that's going to interact with things that remove the benefit of cover, although if it is worded that it removes the benefit of cover, then they probably cancel each other out. But what this allows you to do is ignore terrain if you're an assault army. So let's say you're playing a Tyranid Godzilla army. You have a whole bunch of melee Carnifexes, and the reason why I use this example is because one of my close friends who plays Tyranids, this was his army for a while. He can now deploy everybody up front, wait a turn, give his opponent the first turn to make it easier when he charges, and he can now put up the benefit of cover anywhere it is. That might work really well for reactive assaulting armies. This gives some more interesting decisions to be made about who goes first and who goes second. 2 CP is not super steep, but it also makes it so you kind of have to have this sort of planned out. I like this rule. I've been thinking about this all morning, and you know what? I've been going back and forth on it, but the more I kind of talk it out with you guys, the more I kind of like this, because this gives you some more options, and I'm a huge fan of options. So going second, you now have a little bit more of a buffer on things if you're trying to catch your opponent that has moved forward. Now, if your opponent's a gunline, they're not going to move forward, so you're going to want to go first anyway. But this is not a bad rule at all. I will even go so far as to say I like this. I think this will be a good mix-up to the game. All right, the second new beta match play rule, Tactical Restraint. Tactical Restraint is a new rule that limits the rate in which command points can be regenerated throughout the battle via warlord traits, relics, etc. With the increase in the total number of command points available to all armies that was introduced in the spring update, we increased the number of command points that battalions and brigades gave a player. These types of rules were made commensurably better. This matched play rule attempts to correct this, ensuring that your pool of command points remains a precious resource. Tactical Restraint. There are several warlord traits, relics, and abilities that give you a chance to gain or refund command points when you or your opponent either use a stratagem or spend command points to use a stratagem. In match play games, each player can only gain or have refunded a total of 1 command point per battle round as the result of such rules, regardless of the source. This does not apply to the Moment Shackle or the Sevenfold Chant abilities, or to the player of the Twilight Warlord trait. In these cases, the ability/warlord trait can refund or gain the player more than 1 command point if the stratagem used cost 2 or more command points to use. But only once any command points have been gained as a result of the rule, neither it nor any similar rule can be used to gain more command points until the next battle round. Also note that this does not apply to the command points that are gained or refunded as specifically instructed on stratagems such as feeder tendrils, agents of Vect, etc. I hate this rule. I absolutely despise this rule. Why would I possibly do this? I'm a guard player. I have all the command points in the world. Insert that one picture of the guy trying to hold things, and he can't possibly hold all these command points. I'm not going to do that, but that's the idea. The idea that you are now limited in how many command points you can gain really kind of flies in the face of armies that like to use a lot of command points, like Guard. We have stratagems that we want to use every single turn. We want to use a dice reroll every single time. We may as well. We have a lot of command points and a lot of ways to gain command points. It's kind of a trait of our army. The most common Guard army in terms of Warlord and Free Relic is Kurov's Aquila and the Grand Strategist. Why? Kurov's Aquila, every time your opponent plays a stratagem, roll a d6. You have a 1/3 chance of, if you roll a 5 up, you gain a command point. Grand Strategist, every time you spend a command point, roll a d6. On a 5 up, you get that command point back. So this now makes both of those things kind of useless, because a maximum of 6 command points over the course of the game, that's not really worth anything. That's really kind of pathetic. So this is bad, in my opinion. Now, I know why they did this, because right now the Loyal 32 is a pretty big problem. For those of you who don't know, the Loyal 32 is a fairly simple Guard battalion that is 140-something points, or maybe around there, and is just tacked on to any other Imperium force out there. So if you're running Space Marines, you probably are also bringing a Loyal 32 detachment. And the Loyal 32 is pretty simple. You have a company commander, generally another company commander, or if you want to change it up, you can throw in a Psyker, and 3 Guard infantry squads. The Guard infantry squads cost 40 points apiece. The company commanders cost 61 points apiece. So 120, or 31 points apiece. So 120 plus 62 is 182 points. So not 140, 182 points for this whole thing. You also make that your Warlord, and you give him Kurov's Aquila. And now, not only have you dragged along an additional 5 command points for 182 points, you now get to regain command points a lot. So they're trying to attack that so that they can limit Space Marines. The one I'm personally thinking of is probably Blood Angels, because you know what you guys did wrong. I don't like that. This is, again, them damaging other armies because certain cross-play things happen, and I'm not a fan. I like the ability to just constantly regenerate command points. It puts me in a very comfortable position, and when you're an army like the Guard, who basically everything is a coin flip, it's really kind of necessary to get any sort of reliability out of your shooting. Yes, there is something to be said about strength in numbers, but when a critical las cannon shot goes down, knowing that I can buff that to a 75% chance to hit once per round is important. By the way, if you're a new or young Guard player, or really just a new or young 40k player, never spend a command point to hit unless you're desperate. The best use of a command point is to be spent using it to reroll damage, because damage already got through. Anyway, small digression. So I don't like Tactical Restraint. I think Tactical Restraint is a bad idea. I think that it's far too restrictive. I would be okay if this were every phase, because at that point, then you've got a whole bunch of command points you could get back, but it's not like, oh, I played 6 stratagems, let me roll for every single one of them to see if I get everything back. I can understand a certain desire to restrain the idea in its generality. And so this is kind of my feedback to Games Workshop if they ever get to the point of watching any of these videos, which I kind of doubt. Change this to phase. Or change this at least to once per player turn. because making it so it's each battle round, which means you only get to do this once per battle round. Your turn, their turn, that's a battle round. So 6 command points in total over a standard 6-turn limited game. That's not enough. Not if you want to make sure that abilities like Grand Strategist, like Kurov's Aquila, still have any weight or meaning to them. So very much would like to see this changed. I think this is too heavy-handed. I can understand where it's coming from, but let's kick it back to per phase and see how that goes, rather than per round, or at the very least per player turn. That way you can get at least 12 command points out of it. Then it might be worth something. But just saying, just in general, even if you have 2 of these things, you only get 1 command point back, that's far too much in my opinion. I don't like this ability at all, and I hope that it changes. Now, I have reasonable hope that it'll change in the future. I mean, Games Workshop has actually been pretty good on changing these rules, but I really hope that they take into account that, guard commanders like me, we need these command points. We spend these command points. They're important to us, and our army is based around the idea of a solid chain of command. So, please, G-dubs, remove tactical restraint. Or at least change it to per phase. Interim battle review. We really don't have to look at much into this since none of these are guard. So, further to the above match play rules, we have decided to make a number of small errata to enhance the balance of Warhammer 40k based on community feedback. As errata, these are effective immediately and detailed below. Stratagems. The Warp Surge stratagem appears to be too effective, enabling a potential invuln save of 2+. As a result, we are making a small change to this stratagem. This change appears in the Codex Chaos Demons errata, but is shown below for convenience. And Warp Surge, basically, they just added in this little section, improve invulnerable saves by 1 to a maximum of 4+. Okay, good change. If you're spending for a stratagem, maybe make that 3+, because I'm just thinking there are other armies, knights that come to mind, that can get a 3-up invuln save with a relatively easy time. So make the stratagem a little bit better. But I don't play Chaos Demon, so I can't really speak too much of how the balance on that works. Blood Angels, Wings of Fire have gone up to 2 CP. The Imperial Knights, a lot of Imperial Knights changes. Oathbreaker Guidance System, 3 CP. Order of Companions, 3 CP. Darkest Hour, 3 CP. And the Drukhari have their Agents of Vect buffed to 4 CP, which I think, and I'm not positive on this one, but I think that makes it tied for the most expensive stratagem in the game at this point. I don't think there's any 5 CP ones yet. But I do believe, I think Custodes has 1 or 2 4+ ones. If not, then this has become the most expensive stratagem in the game, which is funny to me. And also, Agents of Vect, this stratagem cannot be used if there are no Cabal of the Black Heart units from your army on the battlefield, and cannot be used to affect stratagems used before the battle or during deployment. Just keeping things reasonable. So that's it for the big FAQ. It was relatively short. I mean, it's 5 pages, but half of it is basically stuff that we already know. I mean, this section is just the exact same. This section is a redux of the rule they've been trying to fix. This section is just explaining specifically how these rules interact, so not a whole lot of information here. It's not the longest FAQ. So we actually have some time, and we're going to pop over to the next one. Codex Astra Militarum. There were 4 changes in this. 5 changes in this. So this one I don't think is actually changed from the last time, but it's in magenta. We're going to go over all the magenta ones. So, military... Oh, no. I see what changed. The last one was command squads only. So this one now affects Militarum Tempestus Scions. So... one Tempestus Scion may either replace his Hotshot Lasgun with a Hotshot Las Pistol and a Voxcaster, or take a Hotshot Las Pistol and a Voxcaster in addition to their Hotshot Lasgun. So this finally gives access to the Hotshot Lasgun to the normal Scion squads, because the last time it was command squads only, and we spent quite a bit of time pointing that out. So now, across the board, Military and Tempestus Scions, the choice if you want to bring a Voxcaster or not is, do you want to spend an additional point so that you can take a Hotshot Lasgun with it, in addition to the price of the Voxcaster itself? So, thank you. We needed this. The slab shields have been changed to add 2 armor to saving throws for a model equipped with a slab shield, and vulnerable saving throws are not affected. Seems rather self-explanatory. And then we get into 2 of the interesting ones. One is kind of sad. So jury-rigging, add the following sentence to the stratagem. You can only use a stratagem once per turn. Okay, fine. Not a huge deal. I'm pretty sure that's just a clarification, because I don't ever recall ever managing to use jury-rigging more than once per turn. I think you may have been able to make a claim that it could be used if you were acting as if you were in the shooting phase, but that would be a stretch. So this doesn't really seem to be a change to me about how it's normally played. Take cover, unfortunately, finally has been slain. It has gone the way of Crush Them as the hilarious Imperial Guard stratagems that we could once use to do some really funky things and can be no more. Change the rules of this stratagem to read, use this stratagem in your opponent's shooting phase when your opponent selects one of your Astra Militarum units as a target. You can add 1 to the armor saving throws you make for this unit until the end of the phase. This used to be just +1 to saving throws. It used to be originally, because I believe Take Cover has actually been nerfed twice, it used to be just anytime they target an Astra Militarum unit, and now it's Astra Militarum infantry. And we used to be able to buff invuln saves. So what you would do is you would take somebody who had like a 5-up invuln save, like say a company commander, and then you would use Psychic Shield on him, which gives him +1. Okay, he's not got a 4-up save. And then you tell him to take cover, and now he's got a 3-up invuln. Well, you can't do that anymore. They finally explicitly knocked that out. It's kind of sad. It's the end of yet another era, but it makes sense. I can't complain too much about it. It was kind of amusing times when you could get some really hilarious invuln saves going on, but it needed to be nerfed. Yes, I understand. And the last thing we're going to look at today, the Warhammer 40k Rulebook Official Update version 1.3. We're actually not going to look at most of this. We're not going to go through the explicit points here because they didn't address the things that I really cared about. So it's just order of operations things, really simple, straightforward. It's not going to affect you unless you were trying to be that guy and try and break things a bit. So we're going to move right to the general questions FAQ. If you want me to go over that stuff, leave a comment. I suppose I could just go line for line through all the magenta things on every single codex. I don't think you guys would be that interested in that. Part of this, I think, is that we kind of discuss, chat, and talk about the how we think about these rules, and I would have nothing to add other than, well, yeah, that's the way it was supposed to be played, or, oh, you changed one small value that barely mattered anything. So the general FAQ can be kind of interesting. So, the first question in magenta, can I ever skip a phase or the part of a phase? For example, if my army contains no psychers, can I skip my psychic phase? And the answer is a pretty obvious no. You must play out all the phases in a turn and all the parts of each phase. In the example you give, your opponent may have rules or stratagems that are used in your psychic phase, and so you cannot skip it. This was rather obvious to me, but it's nice to have an explicit clarification that no, you don't get to skip any phases. I never thought that you could, but eh. The next one, however, was pretty interesting to me. If a unit has a strength characteristic of dash, but I need to use that characteristic to resolve a rule, e.g. shooting web pistols or webbers with the death grip stratagem, what value do I use? Substitute the unit's toughness characteristic for its strength characteristic for the purposes of resolving such rules. The reason I find this interesting is just because we are substituting another characteristic in general. And that just seems like a really easy thing to abuse at some point. I don't know yet what you would abuse it with, but I'm certain it's out there and I want to find out what we can do to break it. I'm going to be looking through a couple of other codexes to see just all the units that have a dash as a strength characteristic, or really any characteristic, and see how they interact, because I would be really fascinated to know what that could break, because it really feels like it probably should break something. If a rule allows me to reroll damage rolls of 1, and the damage characteristic for the weapon is a d3, do I roll the d6 rolls of 1 and 2, which I have to get a d3 result, or only the original d6 of 1? To which Games Workshop very rightly points out, in this case, you reroll the d3 result, so you reroll a 1 or a 2 if you roll on a d6. Again, there are d3s that you can buy. I mean, I played against them in Adepticon, it was hilarious to look. It's kind of weird, but hey. And for the purposes of strategic discipline matched play rules, are stratagems with identical names that appear in different codexes, e.g. Veterans of the Long War, which is a stratagem in the Codex Chaos Space Marines, Codex Death Guard, and Codex Thousand Suns, considered to be the same stratagem. To which Games Workshop very intelligently says, yes, this means that in match play games, such stratagems can only be used once per phase regardless of their source. For example, if you use Veterans of the Long War stratagem from Codex Chaos Space Marines, you cannot use it in the same phase for Veterans of the Long War from either Codex Death Guard or Codex Thousand Suns. This reminds me of a problem that was had back over in the X-Wing miniatures game. I don't know if any of you have played it. It's actually pretty fun, and the starter set is pretty reasonably priced. And what it basically came out to be was certain cards would be equipped to you. So a title or a piece of equipment would be equipped to you based on your name. And eventually a unit came out that had part of the name that was originally for a piece of equipment for something else, which allowed you to use it. And they kind of ruled that that was acceptable. This is a much more reasonable ruling, saying, no, If the stratagem is called the exact same thing, it's the exact same stratagem, and it exists in a pool of stratagems that may only be used once. This actually kind of simplifies things if you're trying to digitize the game at all, but this is a good clarification, and one that actually kind of need to be made. This, however, is an annoying clarification, not because I care really about what this clarification says, but more as it addresses something that needs to be addressed, but not what explicitly needs to be addressed, and I'll go off on a tangent shortly after I read it. If a unit with a minimum move characteristic is affected by an ability which changes its move characteristic, do I change both its minimum and maximum move characteristics? Yes. For example, an undamaged Hemlock Wraith fighter has a move characteristic of 20 to 60. If it was affected by the Doom Bell Psychic Power, in the following movement phase, its movement characteristic is 10 to 30. Well, one, that's really cool. Okay, I care about it a little bit because that provides some interesting things to try and do some super tight, short maneuvering, if you can try, sort of bait your opponent to try and use things on you. But no, the thing that kind of annoys me here is one of my current problems with 40k right now is a very specific rule regarding minimum movement and self-destruction and deep strike. For those of you who don't know, I'm an Imperial Guard player. I've mentioned this shortly before, but hey, welcome to the club if you haven't been listening. I'm an Imperial Guard player who really likes bringing planes, and in order to bring planes to the maximum effectiveness that I can bring them at, what I do is I bring them as an Elysian detachment. By doing this, all my planes can deep strike. The problem is, if you deep strike an aircraft, it has moved for the purposes of firing heavy weapons. It has moved for all intents and purposes when it arrives on the battlefield. But it has not necessarily moved 20 inches, which is its minimum move distance. So does the aircraft self-destruct or not because it was incapable of moving its full move distance? Now, when I went to Adepticon, I explicitly emailed them ahead of time and asked, hey, how are you guys going to rule on this? And they said that they were going to rely on a connection with the recently changed Talarn outflank rule, which said that a Layman Russ was considered to have moved its maximum movement characteristic whenever it outflanked from off-board. And they said, in order to be consistent with that, we will count it as have moving its maximum movement. However, that's on a case-by-case basis, because different clubs will have different ideas, different tournaments will have different ideas. This is something that does need to be addressed by Games Workshop directly, and they still haven't. Yes, the Elysian detachment is a Forge World problem, but this could potentially move in to affect other things. It needs to be addressed, and it hasn't been addressed. And that's my major complaint right now about one of the major issues when it comes to just the basic rulebook, is how does that interact with something that physically can't move its actual movement distance? Because yes, technically it's moved. It will not be considered standing still when it comes in, but it hasn't moved 20 inches. So does it kill itself or not? That's the question that they haven't answered. Question: if a stratagem such as Auspex Scan or Forewarned to shoot with a unit as if it were in the shooting phase, does the restriction on not being able to target an enemy character with a wounds characteristics of 10 or less apply, even though that stratagem is being used in the movement phase? The answer is yes. Oh, thank God. So the fact that characters can't be targeted in the shooting phase except... can't be targeted in the shooting phase, and only in the shooting phase, has been a major issue. I have fought against Noise Marines before at Adepticon. At Adepticon, there was a player who had a fairly large force of Noise Marines, and I had a Astropath hidden behind a group of about 20 infantry. And I knew, because we had talked about this at my club prior to going there, that I would be vulnerable to this. I knew that if I shot and killed them, they were not being targeted in the movement. They were not targeting my Astropath in the shooting phase. They were targeting them as part of a special ability. And because of that, they were allowed to shoot my Astropath. This gets rid of that, finally. This has been needed. So this basically says, okay, the shooting phase limitation on targeting characters lasts the entire game. Deal with it. Which is really good. Now, the fact that this was a problem at all is understandable, because you would imagine that, oh, well, shooting phase, that's going to cover it. But thank God this finally got through, because now, if you run a lot of characters, and Guard run a lot of characters, you've basically now got the full protection you were always supposed to have. Now, the next two, I'm not 100% sure on how they're going to interact, but we're going to go through them both, and then we'll talk about them. Question: can you perform heroic interventions in your opponent's charge phase, even if they did not declare any charges in that phase? The answer is yes. And Can you ever perform a heroic intervention during your own turn? No. So, the situation is pretty interesting, but this also relates back to, can you skip a phase? So if I don't charge you, do we skip the charge phase? No, because things like heroic intervention can go off. So let's say that I am involved in melee combat with an enemy unit, and I have been desperately avoiding their whatever character. Well, now, if they manage to get close enough, 3 inches, to heroically intervene with me, then they can now heroically intervene even though no charge actually occurred. This is nice. This is a pretty niche circumstance that this will ever come up, simply because if you got 3 inches away anyway, you're probably going to charge. I'm struggling to think of a situation where you wouldn't want to charge a unit that was already in melee combat. Or it just seems really weird to me. Like, it's a good rule change. I like this clarification. I think this is fine. I'm just really struggling to figure out a situation where you'd ever deliberately put yourself in a position and the circumstance where that would simply come about. But in any event, stay away from characters you want to avoid more than 3 inches. Otherwise, they're going to heroically intervene on you, and you won't get to shoot them. Question. If a unit uses a rule that removes them from the battlefield and then sets them up again, such as the Teleport Homer ability or the Gate of Infinity Psychic Power, does that unit count as having moved for the purpose of moving and firing heavy weapons? Answer, yes. I thought that was pretty clear, but good. Excellent. And there should be one more rule. No, there's 3 more rules. And a couple of clarifications down below. Question. When a unit has mounts that have a melee profile, for example, Thunderwolf Cavalry, can that unit make any attacks that they wish to with that mount's melee profile, or can they only make additional attacks as noted on the weapons profile abilities text? You only make an additional attacks as noted in the abilities text. Which is good, because otherwise we're saying that when whatever character running as Thunderwolf Cavalry gets to make his mounts attacks, in addition to his normal thing, rather than just additional attacks. It's a minor thing. Again, it's going to be a little bit niche, but whatever. Can a unit with fortifications battlefield role control an objective marker? Yes, so long as the building is considered to be a friendly unit. Note that this means that fortifications like Feculent Gnarlmaws cannot control objective markers. I thought this was the case anyway, simply because if I plant a bastion down, I own the bastion. Me and a friend of mine who plays orcs had been joking about for a long time about allowing orcs to have a stratagem that would allow them to deep strike bastions explicitly for the purposes of controlling markers, and also because it would be hilarious. The final ability, and one I kind of care about, are teleport homers or infestation nodes friendly models. Can they control objective markers? No to both questions. So this is good and also bad. So it's good because teleport homers really shouldn't be controlling things. Like, I don't understand why a teleport homer would control an objective, but the idea that infestation nodes, which are super vulnerable anyway and easily popped, don't control an objective, that kind of seems like you're being a bit of a jerk to the Tyranid player. Like, it's not massively game affecting. It is so easily removed from the board that I kind of feel that saying it can't control an objective, especially because, well, it's part of the Tyranid army, seems a little off. But hey, they want to limit and restrict those things. Alright, for the last bit, we get to talk about a couple of specific things. There are clarifications on the, in my opinion, terrible organized event guidelines concerning datasheets and army. If you don't know, I hate this. I absolutely hate the fact that now, based on the number of detachments, limits the number of datasheets you include. Because I think that limits a lot of Guard players to certain play styles, and I think that it takes a lot of choices out of certain armies. I'm not happy about this at all. This was a blunt force method of trying to balance the game purely because of things like Flying Hive Tyrant's ban. And instead of trying to go case by case to fix this problem, they just took a sledgehammer to it, and I hate how they've done this. I'm not happy about this at all, but there have been some clarifications to it just in case anybody was trying to be a jerk to you about what you can and can't bring on the actual field. So, squadrons. Some units, like Carnifexes and Layman battle tanks, can contain up to 3 models each, but after they are set up on the battlefield, they each become individual units how many of these models can I include in my army if I'm using the organized event guidelines for, say, a 2,000 point game? You can include up to 3 units in a 2,000 point game, meaning you could include up to 9 of these models. Now, this is a clarification that shouldn't be needed, but apparently some people have a hard time actually reading that this rule up here, the big change to the number of datasheets, is for datasheets. So what does the datasheet say? Well, the Layman Russ datasheet says you can have up to 3 Layman Russes per datasheet. So anybody who was trying to give any problems with this was being a little bit of a jerk, not really playing on the up and up. And so this shouldn't have been required, but hey, we gotta roll with it. Now, the tactical drones one was a little bit more interesting. I also think it should have been played this way anyway, and the clarification isn't super required, but I can understand where you might get a little confused. Do tactical drones that are taken as upgrades for certain Tau Empire units, e.g. the XV-8 Crisis Battlesuits, XV-25 Stealth Battlesuits, etc., count as units for the purpose of the Organized Events Guidelines, and so count towards the number of tactical drones units? And the answer is no. Now, I thought this again would be under the datasheet exception, but given that there's actual drone units, I can understand where some confusion may occur. But again, that kind of seems like it would be covered under the exception, just saying you get a number of data sheets. Just imagine that if you have to assemble your entire army and place them on top of the data sheet, that specific sheet can only show up 3 times. Unless you have some pretty interesting army-wide mitigations, which I assume at some point they will get around to. Like Forge World Layman Russ tanks, technically all of those have different data sheets. So I could bring 9 Conquerors, 9 Layman Russ battle tanks, and 9 something else. Executioners, maybe? I forget if it's the Executioner or the Exterminator that's running the autocannons. It's useless anyway. And the final clarification when it comes to number of data sheets are the Daemon Prince Codex datasheets from Codex Chaos Space Marines, the Daemon Prince of Nurgle datasheet from Codex Death Guard, and the Daemon Prince of Tzeentch datasheet from Codex Thousand Suns, all considered different datasheets for the purposes of organized events? Yes. So basically, if you bring multiple armies, yeah, their datasheets don't necessarily conflict. So that was the big FAQ, as well as the related FAQs for the Astra Militarum, which we care about, and the actual general rulebook, which had some pretty interesting clarifications on how things go. What do you think about it? I think the big FAQ on a whole, almost all of it is good. The tactical reserves is okay now. It's acceptable. It's reasonable. The prepared positioning, I think, is really interesting. I really like it. And I think tactical restraint is an absolute pile of dog. Flaming, I'm not going to go into excrement on that. I don't like that rule at all. But what do you guys think? Anything that I talked about, do you have a different opinion on sort of how things go down? Is a rule really good that I think is terrible? Do you think tactical restraint is fantastic? Is it the greatest thing since sliced bread? How about the new tactical reserves rule? Do you see any major loopholes or something that's going to come out of it? I would be fascinated to hear your thoughts. It's always interesting to hear from other commanders. Anyway, I've been Tarek. If you like this kind of content, well, maybe hit that subscribe button. We don't do this super often. This channel is more about Star Trek and Battletech and doing Let's Plays of those games, but hey, every time a big FAQ or chapter approved comes out, we tend to try and cover it, at least with regards to the Guard Codex, because it can have some pretty interesting conversations. So if you like that kind of content, or if you like things like Star Trek games, or Battletech, which is a pretty interesting game, I kind of highly recommend you go check it out, then hit that subscribe button. Check it out every time it comes out. If you want to receive a notification every time I put something out, well, tap the little bell. And again, leave a comment, anything that you think about what's going on here. Anything I may have missed or misinterpreted into this, hey, fill me in, let me know. And I will see you all in the next episode.